There is a special kind of magic found in music that's grown in isolation. This is the story of one isolated island and how, against all odds, it produced one of my favourite songs of all time. Iceland is an island in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. It's a country with no indigenous population ever recorded. When it was settled by the Norse, in somewhere around 800 AD, the island was found to be entirely empty. Today, there are just over 400,000 proud Icelandic people. Like a lot of countries in this part of the world, Iceland has a deep connection to folk music. But what makes Icelandic folk particularly interesting is its focus on the human voice. One of the best examples of this is Rima, a form of epic narrative poetry that sits somewhere between singing and storytelling. For centuries, these poems were passed down through generations, preserving Icelandic stories and legends. Rima remained largely unchanged for hundreds of years. More recently, however, we do start to find the outside world creeping in. During the 20th century, Iceland encountered American jazz through the Allied occupation in World War II, then rock and roll in the 1950s, beat music in the 60s, and eventually punk in the late 70s. Punk is a huge moment for Iceland. Its inherent links to DIY culture was a perfect fit for an isolated group of young musicians. Bands like Friblanir sang in Icelandic rather than in English or Danish. They wrote about Reykjavik and Icelandic life. Punk became a way to modernise youth culture within the country, without losing their connection to it. The music label Gram would be instrumental to this scene. It would be the home of a lot of the core Icelandic punk groups, a lot of which can be found in the documentary Rock í Reykjavik.
Gram would also eventually sign a band called Tapi Tíkaras. These guys were important because they were fronted by a young teenager called Björk.
When Björk Gulmannsdóttir was born in 1965, Iceland had no idea it had just produced one of its most important artists. Growing up in Reykjavik, Björk showed an extraordinary musical ability from a young age. Her first album, released when she was just 11, became a surprise hit in Iceland. As Björk entered her teenage years, she would collide with the blossoming punk scene happening in her hometown. By the age of 14, Björk was already playing in bands and moving through the same small network of musicians that was reshaping Icelandic music. One of those musicians was Einar Örn Benediktsson. Einar was the frontman of Perkur Pilnik and one of the founders of Gran Records. He was basically one of the people building the scene that Björk was entering. In 1983, Björk and Einar would first properly collaborate when they joined forces for a performance at the closing show of Icelandic radio programme Afangar. The band that was created for this performance would be called Kukul. With Björk and Einar sharing vocal duties, Kukul represented everything exciting about Reykjavik's underground. But it wasn't to last.
When Kukul eventually dissolved, the connections made within the label and art collective Bad Taste would bring Björk, Einar and a group of other Reykjavik musicians together once again. This time they called themselves Skjør Molinir, better known to us English speakers as the Sugarcubes.
This is one of the moments that music in Iceland changed forever. Because in 1987, the Sugarcubes released Birthday. Despite being recorded in the 1980s, Birthday retains its novelty. Its bizarre off-kilter rhythm is accompanied by a tumbling bass line and almost avant-garde miniature trumpet flourishes. This is then paired with subtle guitar hints and eventually topped by the enchantingly weird vocals, written and sung by Björk. Originally sung in Icelandic, the lyrics perfectly match their unusual accompaniment. The story of the song feels timelessly naive. It's about a 5-year-old girl who collects worms on a string and spiders in her pocket. We find her and her older neighbour sitting together, listening to the weather, evoking the feeling of sheltering from the brutal storms that Iceland is famous for. The song is often mistakenly thought to be about child abuse, a theory that Björk herself has dismissed several times. I like to imagine that the song is about an unlikely friendship between an old man and a child, but the lyrics really feel deliberately vague and ultimately subjective. For me, this song is as close to being perfect as I could ever imagine a singular song could be. But on paper, none of this should have worked as an international hit. A 4-minute song from Iceland with strange lyrics and even stranger vocals, made by a band that nobody had heard of. But somehow it did work. After appearing as an Icelandic B-side, Birthday was re-recorded in English, ahead of the Sugarcubes' debut album, Life's Too Good. Almost immediately, the British music press fell in love with it. Melody Maker and NME championed the single, but perhaps the biggest endorsement came from John Peel, when it was listed as number 1 in his 1987 Festive 50 list. Almost overnight, the Sugarcubes went from a tiny Reykjavik art punk band to one of the most talked about new acts in the world. All thanks to Birthday. It would be easy to end this story by saying that Birthday made Björk famous. But honestly, I think that's missing the point. Because the story of Birthday isn't so much the story of Björk as it is the story of the place she came from. Iceland has centuries of songs, stories and traditions, and the Sugarcubes are simply a continuation of those things. What set them apart though was that by the time the Sugarcubes arrived, they weren't trying to sound like Britain or America anymore. They sounded like Reykjavik, and that, to me, is what makes them so special. For many people outside of Iceland, Birthday was the first time contemporary Icelandic music entered the global conversation. Against all odds, this tiny group of musicians, from a tiny island in the North Atlantic Ocean, broke through to the rest of the world. That was what Birthday was. One of the world's most unlikely hits. Hey, thank you for watching all the way to the end. I hope everyone's doing good.
Apologies for my butchering of Icelandic pronunciations. You know, I did my best.
If you can afford it, then please consider joining my Patreon. It'd be really cool to be able to start making some money from these videos. Go and follow my Instagram if you can while you're at it. And yeah, make sure you like the video and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.